The integumentary system is made up of three different layers: the epidermis, dermis, and hypodermis. But when we talk about the skin is only made up of two of these layers, the epidermis and the dermis. So when we talk about skin, the hypodermis is not a component of skin. Now, if we take a look at our arms or our legs, the layer of skin that is visible to us is known as the epidermis. So it is essentially the visible layer. Now, if we take a look at this diagram over here, we can note that the dermis actually makes up the majority of the skin, and the epidermis actually makes up a very small portion of the skin. Now, a way to remember the order of epidermis, dermis, and hypodermis from superficial to deep, we can remember that the prefix epi, it means above. So if epi means above, that means that this must be the most superficial layer, or the one at the very top or above. The prefix hypo means low, and we can correlate that to being at the bottom or below. So epi means the top one, and hypo means below, so it must be the bottom one. So the order from most superficial to deep is epidermis, dermis, and hypodermis. Now, if we take a look at the epidermis, we have 5 layers: the stratum corneum, the stratum lucidum, stratum granulosum, stratum spinosum, and stratum basale. Now, over here in this diagram, we can actually see all 5 of these layers, and if we look closely, we can see that the thickest layer is actually the stratum spinosum. Now, going back to these 5 layers of the epidermis, we can see that the most superficial layer, so the most outermost layer, is the stratum corneum, and the most deepest layer is the stratum basale. Now, if we take a look at our skin and it's flaking or it's dry, that topmost layer is known as the stratum corneum, and we'll get into more detail about the composition of the stratum corneum. Now, a way to remember the order of all 5 layers of the epidermis, we can remember this acronym, which is Come Let's Get Sunburned, where the C stands for corneum, L for lucidum, G for granulosum, S for spinosum, and B for basale. We can also remember that basal is at the very bottom because basal can be corresponded to basement, and we know that in our houses, the basement is the most bottom floor. So we can correlate basal to basement. And right below the stratum basale, that is where we can see our dermis begins. Now, dermis is the second layer of our skin. Now, if we take a closer look at the stratum corneum, we can see that it is the outermost layer of the epidermis. So essentially, it is the most superficial layer. Now, the stratum corneum contains a specific type of cell, which is called a corneocyte. Now, we can remember the term corneocyte because it sounds very similar to the level we are at, which is corneum. So, a corneocyte is essentially a dead keratinocyte. Now, we'll get into more details about where these keratinocytes come from, but for now, all we need to know that a keratinocyte is a cell containing melanin and keratin. Now, the stratum corneum, since it is the outermost layer of the skin, it is essentially the layer of dead skin on our epidermis. So this layer of stratum corneum protects us from infection, water loss, and physical harm. Now, for example, if we were to have some sort of abrasion to the skin, which only harmed the stratum corneum, it would not cause severe damage because the stratum corneum already consists of cells that are dead. And if abrasion is caused to dead cells, it will not cause much harm. Now, if we move forward to the stratum lucidum, which is the second layer of our epidermis right below the stratum corneum, we can note that the stratum lucidum contains dead keratinocytes. Now, you may ask, isn't a dead keratinocyte essentially a corneocyte? Well, the answer is no. That's because when we're moving from stratum basal to stratum corneum, essentially the cells that are moving up are undergoing differentiation, which means that they are changing. So at each level, the cells are going to be slightly different. So at the stratum lucidum level, we have these dead keratinocytes, but they still have to undergo further differentiation in order to fully become a corneocyte. So at the stratum lucidum level, we only have dead keratinocytes, and they have not yet fully become a corneocyte. Now, what's also unique to stratum lucidum is that it is only present in areas of thick skin. So where do we find thick skin? Thick skin can be found in our palms and our feet. If we take a look at our palms and the soles of our feet, we can note and we can feel that it is actually thicker than, for example, our arm. So stratum lucidum, it will only be found in our hands and feet and not in other locations of our skin, in different areas of the body. Now, the next level is the stratum granulosum, which is the third level of our epidermis, right below stratum lucidum. Now, the stratum granulosum is the first place where we are going to see living keratinocytes. Now, remember that in the first two levels, we had dead keratinocytes, but now we have living keratinocytes. Now, what's also interesting about stratum granulosum is that it contains lamellar granules. Now, these lamellar granules are essentially small granules that will form a hydrophobic membrane, and this membrane is what creates a water barrier for the skin. That's why, for example, if you pour water on your hand, it will not absorb into your skin. That's because of this lamellar granules that are found within stratum granulosum. The fourth layer of the epidermis is the stratum spinosum, which makes up the thickest portion of our epidermis. Now, the stratum spinosum contains living keratinocytes, and it also contains desmosomes, which are essentially cell adhesion junctions which attach cells together via intermediate filaments within their cytoskeletons. Now, when these desmosomes attach these cells together through their intermediate filaments, this is what allows cells with the strength and flexibility. Because remember, our skin has to wrap around several structures, and we need flexibility in order for the skin to wrap around these structures. So the spinosum level is what allows that flexibility because of the attachment due to the desmosomes, which are essentially just cell adhesion junctions. Now, the stratum spinosum also contains Langerhans cells, which are dendritic cells of the epidermis, which allow for communication between the innate and adaptive immune system. Now, we know that the skin is our outermost barrier of contact, and it makes sense that within our skin, we have a layer that allows for communication towards our immune system. And this is done through the Langerhans cells. Now, within the stratum spinosum, we can also see mitosis occurring to a certain extent. So essentially mitosis, which is the division of cells, so we're producing cells, it mainly occurs in the stratum basal. But in the lower levels of the stratum spinosum, we can also see mitosis occurring. But as we move up, mitosis is no longer able to occur. So in the stratum basal and the lower levels of the stratum spinosum, we can see mitosis and more cells being produced, which will move further up to the stratum corneum. Now, the last layer is the stratum basal, which contains the keratinocyte stem cells, which produce the keratinocytes. Now, remember that these keratinocytes are cells containing melanin and keratin, and these keratinocytes are moving up. And as they move up, when they reach stratum lucidum and corneum, they become dead keratinocytes, and they will essentially be shed off. Now, the stratum basal also contains two different types of cells, which are Merkel cells and melanocytes. So the Merkel cells are essentially light touch receptors, which are synapsing with our brains, synapsing with neurons, which send messages to our brain. And it makes sense that these Merkel cells will be predominantly found within our fingertips because our fingertips are the main source of touch. So when you touch something, these receptors are synapsing with the neurons and they will send signals to our brains, which will initiate some sort of a response. Now we have also melanocytes found within stratum basale, which are essentially the cells that produce melanin. And remember that our keratinocyte contains melanin. So where is this melanin coming from? It's coming from our melanocyte. So once the melanocyte produces melanin, it will move into the keratinocyte. And that keratinocyte will move up through the layers of the epidermis. And lastly, the stratum basale is a single layer of cells, and it is the primary location of mitosis. And that is essentially everything regarding the layers of the epidermis. Now, remember, the way you can recall all 5 levels of the epidermis is through the acronym COME, Let's Get Sunburnt. And remember that the Stratum Spinosum is the thickest layer of the epidermis, but the Stratum Lucidum is found in areas of thick skin, for example, the palms and the soles of our feet.